There are stories that begin with lightning, with heartbreak, with a fall so sudden it shakes the soul free of everything familiar. And then there are stories like this. One slow stories, soft ones, the kind that begin not with noise, but with a silence so deep it aches. This is a story not of tragedy, but of what comes after, of how we learn to stay, how we learn to breathe again. Even when the air still tastes like sorrow, it's the story of Sarah and how one broken woman became a garden, a guidepost, and a quiet kind of hope. If you've ever felt lost, if you've ever sat in the dark wondering if the light would return, this story is for you, not because it has answers, but because it remembers the questions. Let's begin. Sarah sat in the stillness of dawn, the world around her not yet awake, the sky hanging in soft purples and grays. Her porch swing creaked gently beneath her, a rhythmic counterpoint to the heavy quiet. A cardigan hung loosely from her shoulders, and her hands clutched a lukewarm mug of tea she had long forgotten to sip. Morning mist hovered across the yard, clinging to grass like a secret. She had moved here 6 months ago, half a country away from the city where her mother had died in the middle of the night. 3 years earlier, the grief hadn't hit her all at once. It had settled in layers, like dust in a forgotten room. She didn't weep in public or throw things or shout. Instead, she had grown quiet. She had disappeared from her own life. Her friendships thinned. Her work dulled into repetition. And she moved through days with the precision of someone remembering steps but forgetting music. It wasn't that she hadn't tried. She had gone to therapy, taken time off, even tried a week-long silent retreat where she sat in the woods and listened to birds argue about nothing. But still, the ache persisted. It was shapeless, but present like fog pressed against glass. There were moments she questioned if this was all she would ever feel. One evening, unable to sleep, she wandered into the glow of her phone, scrolling not for information, but for proof that other people were still living. That's when she stumbled upon a video. It was poorly lit, shot on a phone. A middle-aged woman speaking about how grief had brought her to the earth literally, how planting seeds, turning soil, and watching green things grow had steadied her heart. There were no tricks, no promises, just stillness, and the slow act of tending. Something about the simplicity of it stuck with Sarah. She replayed the video twice. It wasn't inspiration, it was invitation. The next morning, she found herself searching for therapists with experience in mindfulness and somatic practice. She came across the name Dr. Louis Chung. He didn't look like what she expected. No tweed jacket, no clinical jargon in his profile. Just a kind smile and a sentence that read, "The body remembers, so does the earth." In their first session, he didn't ask her to recount the timeline of her loss. Instead, he listened, slowly and without interruption. When she was done talking, or perhaps when she simply had no more breath, he leaned forward and said, "What's something you can do this week that's just for you?" She blinked, confused, like a task, more like a kindness, he said. Sarah had never thought of self-care as kindness. It had always felt like an assignment she failed at, another item on a list she never completed. She shrugged and said, "Maybe I'll go outside, just for a while." "Perfect," he replied. "Let the earth hold you for a bit." That afternoon, she laced up shoes stiff from disuse and stepped into a quiet park near her neighborhood. She didn't bring headphones. She didn't check the time. She walked until she found a bench, shaded by an old tree. The bark was scarred and soft. She ran her fingers across it and sat. allowing herself to breathe deeply. Birds called out to no one in particular. A child laughed in the distance. The wind moved through the branches like a hymn. For the first time in what felt like years, Sarah didn't feel like a ghost. The next day, she opened an old notebook, not to journal, but to record things she noticed, how the sunlight filtered through blinds, the sound of water boiling, the weight of stillness at night. She didn't know what she was creating, but she liked the feeling of capturing things that didn't ache. Grief hadn't left her, but in those small, careful moments, it stepped aside long enough for her to remember herself. Not the woman she had been before loss, but someone new, someone growing. And so, beneath a pale morning sky, Sarah didn't wait for change to arrive. She began to walk toward it. The heat of summer settled into the air like a weight, pressing down on Sarah in ways that were not just physical. The light outside was golden and long, but inside her apartment, shadows stretched over unwashed dishes and unopened mail. For weeks, she had done well small walks, morning notes, weekly therapy, but something had shifted. It was subtle at first, the return of sleepless nights, the heaviness behind her eyes, the way simple decisions, what to wear, what to eat, felt insurmountable. One morning, she didn't get up. The sun rose without her. She lay still, her body beneath the sheets, but her mind trapped in looping thoughts. You're pretending. You're still broken. You haven't changed at all. The voice wasn't new, but this time it landed like truth. She felt ashamed for regressing, as though grief followed rules she had failed to obey. But that afternoon, when she finally stood and looked at her reflection, she saw not failure, but fatigue. Something inside her stirred a flicker of the tenderness Dr. Chung had asked her to offer herself. She sat at the kitchen table and wrote a letter, not to anyone else, to herself, from the version of her who had already made it through. I know you feel like you're drowning, she wrote, but I see the way you're still breathing. That's what matters, not the pace, not the path, just that you keep walking. I'm proud of you. Even now, it wasn't magic. The fog didn't lift, but something softened. The next day, she laced her shoes again and returned to the park. This time, she walked past the old bench and followed a winding path until it led her to a fenced plot of land. A sign read, "Community Garden Volunteers Welcome." She didn't go in that day, but she returned, again and again, until she finally stepped through the gate. That's where she met Robert. He was tall, with hands worn by labor and eyes softened by sorrow. He didn't ask her why she was there. He handed her gloves and said, "Tomatoes need pruning. You up for that?" They worked in silence. Dirt became the language between them. Days turned into weeks, and Sarah began to learn things no book had taught her: how basil thrives near tomatoes, how compost smells like memory, how weeding can feel like meditation. It wasn't long before Robert shared his story. A former firefighter, he had lost his wife to cancer 6 years earlier. "I used to think strength meant not crying," he said one afternoon, wiping sweat from his brow. "Now I think it means staying soft, even when the world hardens you." His words stayed with her, and slowly, the garden became more than a place to volunteer. It became a sanctuary. Sarah found herself drawn, not just to the plants, but to the people, the quiet mother who planted flowers for her lost son, the teenager who talked to the marigolds as if they could answer. There, grief didn't need to be hidden. It could grow alongside hope. One morning, as she helped replant a patch of dying herbs, she caught herself humming. It was the first sound of joy she had made in months, and she realized, with surprise, that helping others heal was becoming part of her own restoration. Healing, she now understood, wasn't about reaching an end point. It was about choosing, again and again, to stay in the story. Even when the chapter was hard, there was a kind of quiet courage that Sarah hadn't known she possessed until the invitation came. A local wellness center was hosting a panel on community and mental health, and someone had suggested her name. The email sat unopened for 2 days before she gathered the nerve to read it. The idea of standing in front of strangers, exposing pieces of her story, terrified her. But something inside her, something just beginning to believe in her voice, told her to say yes. On the night of the event, she stood beneath soft stage lights, palms sweating, voice trembling. Her words weren't rehearsed. They came from the part of her that had been silent for too long. Healing begins, she said, not with solutions, but with the moment we stop pretending we're fine. She didn't remember much else of what she said, but she remembered the silence afterward, not uncomfortable, but reverent. A room full of strangers exhaled together, and in that shared breath, she felt the first glimpse of something deeper than recovery, connection. In the days that followed, something shifted. Sarah looked at her job, her polished emails, the glossy campaigns, the meetings filled with surface talk, and felt a growing dissonance. The version of herself that once found safety and structure now yearned for something slower, something real. And so, after months of internal wrestling, she left her marketing role and accepted a modest part-time position at the very center where she'd spoken. She began teaching journaling as a tool for healing, simple classes where people sat in circles, pens in hand, hearts tentative but willing. Sarah found joy in the stories that unfolded on paper. Each person who came to her class arrived with invisible weight and left just a little lighter. She started writing more herself, not just in notebooks, but with intention. Slowly, a new idea began to form, not for an article or a blog, but a book, something honest, something rooted. She titled it Roots and Rain before the first chapter was even written. The writing became ritual. In the early mornings before class, in quiet hours after sunset, she poured her story into pages not to be admired, but to be understood. She wrote about grief, not as an obstacle to be overcome, but as a place she had lived and learned to leave slowly. She wrote about walking through numbness, about the weight of silence, about how the smallest gestures, a glance, a garden, a word could build bridges back to oneself. One afternoon, as she was tending a patch of herbs in the garden that had become her second home, a stranger approached. He carried a small camera and an open smile. His name was Joel, a documentary filmmaker working on a project about healing spaces across the country. Sarah agreed to speak with him, unsure why. Their conversation began with logistics and light angles, but soon shifted to memory. He asked thoughtful questions. She gave honest answers. By the time the interview was over, she wasn't thinking about his film at all, only the way it felt to be seen without explanation. Joel returned, not to film, but to visit. He volunteered beside her, pruning vines and sharing pieces of his own story. His presence was never loud. He didn't try to fix or impress. He simply listened, and as the season turned, so did something between them. It wasn't a sweep of romance, but a quiet unfolding. Love, for Sarah, arrived like spring after a long frost gently, and without fanfare. She didn't name it right away. She didn't need to. What mattered was that her heart no longer flinched at hope. It opened, like soil does, ready for what might come next. It was a Tuesday morning when the call came sharp, urgent, pulling Sarah out of a quiet moment with her tea. Her cousin's voice was tight with panic. Uncle Tom had collapsed. A stroke. He was in critical condition. Within hours, Sarah had packed a bag and driven across state lines, the highway unfolding beneath her like a question without punctuation. Hospitals carried their own kind of silence, the kind that buzzed beneath fluorescent lights and settled into waiting rooms. Sarah moved through the days in a kind of suspended animation, taking notes from doctors, arranging shifts with nurses, holding Tom's hand when he drifted in and out of sleep. There were moments, between the beeping machines and murmured prayers, when memory slipped in uninvited. She saw herself at 8 years old, wobbling on a bicycle as Uncle Tom ran beside her, steadying her with both hands. She remembered his laughter, his persistence, the way he never let go until she found her balance. Now it was her turn. She stayed 2 weeks, cooked simple meals, sat with him through physical therapy, encouraged him through each slurred word, each trembling step. But as his strength slowly returned, Sarah felt her own reserves drain. When she finally returned home, her body collapsed into the familiar ache of fatigue. She had given so much of herself, she wasn't sure what was left. At first, she tried to dive back into routine writing, teaching, showing up to the garden, but her words had vanished. Her notebook remained blank, her thoughts scattered. The manuscript she had once poured herself into now sat untouched on her desk, an accusation she couldn't answer. The burnout wasn't loud, but it was relentless. Every small task felt monumental. She questioned everything: her voice, her purpose, her right to be telling a story at all. And then, one evening while sorting through a box of loose papers and cards, she had moved from apartment to apartment without unpacking. She found it, a birthday card from her mother, years old, edges worn. Inside, in familiar looping script, were the words, "You are stronger than you think, and softer than you know. Keep going. My Sarah, the world needs what only you can give." She read it 3 times, the words sinking in like rain into dry ground. That night, she didn't force herself to write. She simply lit a candle, sat in the quiet, and allowed herself to feel it all: the exhaustion, the grief, the gratitude, the fierce, aching love. In the days that followed, she didn't return to the book with urgency, but with reverence, not to finish it, but to understand it. She rewrote sections, not for clarity, but for truth. She let go of structure and listened to story. She let her mother's voice echo beside her own. And when the final sentence came soft, honest, whole, she didn't feel triumph. She felt presence, a deep, abiding sense that something sacred had passed through her and found form. Roots and Rain was born not from inspiration, but from endurance, not from confidence, but from care. It was less a conclusion and more a beginning, and Sarah, once again, found herself starting over, not from the beginning, but from a deeper place inside herself, one shaped by fire, but not consumed by it. With the turning of the season, Sarah found herself standing at the edge of something quieter, but no less profound. The publication of her book had rippled outward in ways she hadn't imagined. There were no bestseller lists, no whirlwind of media, but letters began to arrive. Some came through her website, others tucked inside envelopes with smudged handwriting. People shared fragments of their lives, broken places, buried hopes, tender beginnings. She kept a wooden box on her desk labeled Echoes. In it, she stored these letters like seeds. One was from a widow who had lost her spouse the same year Sarah lost her mother. Another came from a young man in a halfway house, describing how her words helped him stay sober one more night. A teenager sent a drawing of wildflowers with a note that read, "This is what I want to feel like again." Sarah didn't respond to every message, but she read each one with the reverence of someone holding something sacred. These voices reminded her why she had written in the first place, not for applause, but to leave a light on for those still walking through the dark. She brought that same quiet presence to the community garden, where she now spent more time than ever. One afternoon, she proposed a gathering, not a party, but a ritual of sorts, something rooted. That spring, they hosted the first Garden of Reflections. Tables lined with homemade dishes, old quilts laid across the grass. In the center of it all stood a newly planted maple tree. Beside it, a wooden table held small paper leaves and pencils. Sarah invited everyone to write down something they had let go of, or something they had found. People moved slowly, thoughtfully. Children wrote with crayons, elders with trembling hands. The tree filled with color and memory, each leaf fluttering like a quiet hymn. As the sun set, Sarah stood beside Joel, watching the leaves catch light. He reached for her hand, and in his grip she felt a steadiness she hadn't known she needed. Later, after the guests had gone and the sky had turned a deep indigo, Joel turned to her and said, "This feels like the beginning of something bigger." She nodded, understanding, not a new story, but a deepening of the one already written. When he proposed, it was without spectacle, just a question shaped like a promise. She answered without hesitation. Their wedding came together with the same humility that had shaped their love. Friends brought flowers. Elena baked the bread. Robert gave a blessing that made everyone cry. Marcus painted a sign that simply read, "Let love grow wild." They stood beneath strings of soft lights, barefoot on the grass, and instead of vows, they read a letter they had written together. It wasn't a list of promises. It was an offering to stay curious in the quiet, to hold space on the hard days, to keep choosing each other, especially when it's not easy. Later, as music drifted through the trees and laughter hummed beneath the stars, Sarah looked around the garden and felt something she hadn't named in years home. Not a place, but a feeling, not a finish line, but a resting point. She whispered to Joel, "This is the life I never knew I was brave enough to want." And he answered, "But it's the one you grew anyway." The diagnosis came quietly, like an unwelcome whisper in an otherwise clear room. Autoimmune, the doctor had said, manageable, but persistent, a condition that would ask for gentleness, for rest, for a kind of vigilance that Sarah had never practiced with herself before. At first, she bristled. Rest had always been something she earned, not something she embraced. But the body is wiser than the will, and hers had begun insisting, so she slowed down. She canceled talks, reduced her teaching load, and let the manuscript for her next book sit untouched on her desk. Joel adjusted with her, not with pity, but with presence. He brought her tea without asking, tucked blankets around her knees when she forgot to warm herself, held her hand on mornings when moving felt impossible. They retreated for a time to a small cabin tucked among pine and river rock. There, the pace of things was slower still. Mornings were for light walks and bird calls, afternoons for journaling, or simply watching the fire crackle in the hearth. One rainy day, Sarah found herself writing a letter not to herself or her readers, but to a child she wasn't sure she would ever meet. "If you ever come into this world," she wrote, "I want you to know that love isn't something you earn by being good. It's something you already are." She wrote more letters after that, some days scribbling pages, others just a sentence or two. She didn't name the child, didn't decide on a future, but the act of writing softened her. It asked her to hope in a way she hadn't dared in years. Back home, Sarah returned to the garden less often, but when she did, she moved slowly, intentionally. She began mentoring a group of young storytellers, people who wanted to use their voices to hold space for others. Some had survived trauma, others were still in the thick of it. She didn't position herself as the expert. Instead, she listened. She asked questions. She said, "Tell the truth, but tell it gently." And then came the day Marcus told her he was leaving Oregon. His parents needed care. He stood in the garden, the same place they'd once shared tea and silence, and handed her a small wrapped canvas. Inside was a painting of the first bench she had ever sat on in the garden. Above it, a single word painted in small script. "Stay. You helped me do that," he said, his voice thick. She cried, not out of sadness, but recognition that what she had offered quiet presence, patient space had mattered. She hung the painting in her writing room, and on days when her body ached or her mind spiraled into doubt, she would look at it and remember. Staying, too, was a form of becoming. Time, once urgent, now flowed gently around Sarah's days. Years passed in a quiet rhythm, unfolding not with drama, but with depth. She and Joel welcomed a child, whom they named Rowan, after the tree known for both strength and healing. Their home grew into a sanctuary not of perfection, but of presence. They raised Rowan in rhythms of music and silence, wonder and stillness. Sarah sang lullabies. She had written herself songs, threaded with the hush of old grief and the bright hush of morning. They planted trees together in spring, each one chosen for its meaning. Rowan learned the names of birds before the names of brands. Sarah's creative work also deepened, branching outward in ways she hadn't planned. The traveling journal, a project that invited strangers to write and pass on pages of their untold truths, took flight across oceans. Some entries arrived from hospital beds, others from mountaintops or city subways. She read them all, each voice a seed, each truth a harvest of its own. Her connection to the garden evolved too. Alongside a new circle of kindred hands, she co-founded the Gentle Grove, a space rooted in healing through earth, art, and community. There were no slogans, just space. Visitors wandered its winding paths, sat beneath weeping willows, or pressed their hands into soil with trembling reverence. Healing was not promised, but welcomed. Sarah no longer sought the spotlight. When she was invited to accept an award for her work, she did so humbly. Her speech just a few sentences. "I was once buried beneath what I thought would break me, but I learned even the dark is part of how seeds begin." Then she turned the microphone over to a younger voice, unsure but bright-eyed, and that, she later wrote, was the real reward, becoming the root so others could bloom. In her final recorded video, Sarah sat beneath an old sycamore, Rowan's laughter in the distance, and spoke with a gentleness that needed no polish. "You may think you are lost," she said, "but you are already healing because you are still here." And in that stillness, her voice became a lantern left lit on the porch for anyone still making their way home. In the quiet years that followed, Sarah moved through life with a grace born not of ease, but of understanding. Her days grew slower, and her presence softer, yet deeper. She became less visible to the public eye, but more luminous in the lives she touched. She mentored from behind the scenes, offering quiet encouragement to young writers, listening more than she spoke, and reminding them gently, stories don't need to be loud to be true. Rowan, ever observant, inherited that quiet strength. They asked thoughtful questions and noticed the small things, the shift of light on leaves, the tone in someone's silence. Under Sarah's guidance, they learned not just how to grow, but how to tend. The garden was their shared language, their sacred rhythm. When Sarah's time came, it came with a whisper, not a storm. She passed one early morning, the sky still dark, her hand resting in Joel's. It was peaceful, like the closing of a well-loved book, and yet the world did not feel empty in her absence. It felt held, as though she had prepared the earth itself to carry on her presence. The garden, the gentle grove, seemed to bloom brighter in the months that followed, as if mourning and celebrating her all at once. The bench where she often sat now bore an inscription. This is where we remembered who we are. People came not just to grieve, but to return to themselves. Stories were still written in the journal kiosk. Children still chased butterflies near the lavender beds. And Rowan, now grown, continued her work not as a shadow, but as a light of their own. Each year, on the anniversary of her passing, the garden held a gathering not of sadness, but of remembering. People brought soil from places they'd healed. They planted trees in her honor, told stories by candlelight, and shared what they had learned from her: how to be soft in a hard world, how to listen without rushing to reply, how to find home in the act of becoming. Strangers who had never met her still came and sat quietly by her bench. Some would whisper, "If she could heal, maybe I can too." Others would simply breathe, their pain loosening in the presence of something that lingered. And so, Sarah's story continued not in pages or plaques, but in the soil, in the silence, in the sacred echo of being fully present. Like roots that hold the earth in place beneath a quiet, steady rain, her life had become a light that stayed not to guide, but to remind that even in loss there is love, and even in goodbye, a kind of beginning.